Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
Welcome back to another episode of Theology Curator. My name is Kurt Willems, and today I want to talk about the Apostle Paul. In fact, I plan to do several episodes as I'm able, so they're not going to always be in sequence in the sense that, I'm going to have interviews and other content I put out there. But over the long haul, what I would like to do is several short episodes talking about one issue or question pertaining to the Apostle Paul in scholarship or in the life of the church and anything in between. So today we are going to briefly look at the question of Paul and Jewishness. Okay, so I'm framing it this way. Was the Apostle Paul Jewish before and after Jesus? Now, some of you might be saying to yourself, okay, obviously he was. Like, no one denies that. That's the short answer. Paul was clearly Jewish. Nothing we have in the historical record of any reliability calls this into question. So no one is saying he's not Jewish at all, at least that I'm aware of. No one credible, especially. And although he was from Tarsus, according to the book of Acts, he was born to a Jewish family with a history in the Pharisaic movement. He was a Pharisee. Paul was Jewish before and after Jesus. There's no way that we can doubt this. And after Jesus, we might continue the narrative we get in Acts, where the Damascus Road experience happens and he is blind and all of that. You can check that out in Acts, of course, or in Galatians chapter 1, where we get his own sort of narrated version of the story as well. Now, here's the thing. People are curious about, well, what does that Jesus encounter do? Well, we know, at least from the New Testament, that there are times where he clearly is practicing the Jewish laws and customs of his people. And that doesn't really change all that much, except sometimes it might. And that's really where the rubber meets the road, my friends. So really what people often want to know is a slightly different question. And the question might actually be more narrowed down to this. Did Paul remain Jewish after his transforming experience of the resurrected Jesus? Scholars disagree about how best to think about this. And that's really what I want to look at for a couple of quick moments. So what do we do with Paul's Jewishness in scholarship? Now, I can't give you every single view, and I can't give you a thorough or fair accounting of them all in a short episode like this. But I want to give you some broad observations about sort of the approach that scholarship has taken. So there's no major school of thought, whether it be Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, Reformed, the new perspective, the apocalyptic Paul, the radical new perspective. Like, none of those have any claim that Paul forfeited his ethnic identity. One cannot do that. Genetically, it is not possible. Culturally, maybe. So that's ridiculous. Like, no one is making that claim. However, we do want to wrestle with, in what way does Paul hang on to the customs of his people? In what way does he identify as a Jewish man? Or is he, on the radical extreme of this question, is he just a Christian now, in the sense that we all think of Christians and Christianity, and ethnicity used to be a part of his deal, but now he's just a Christian? So what do we want to look at? Well, first, depending on the school of thought, it's going to differ a bit. So let's look at the traditional Paul for a minute. There is a traditional Paul. And this is a catch-all, unfortunately, especially right now, for, you can think of Catholic views, Reformed views, and they have differences that are definitely worth highlighting, especially on justification historically. But in this regard, there is this idea that Paul experienced a clear conversion on the Damascus road. So when Paul began following Christ, he preached that the law was no longer needed as a measure for righteousness, and that applied to himself and to his fellow Jews. Christ is that righteousness perfected. And depending on how you nuance this in this camp, possibly even imputed on the status of every Christian. So in other words, from this view, and again, very broadly speaking, the law is about merit-based salvation, but grace through Christ grants salvation. And that salvation is solely on the merits of Jesus Christ and the righteousness that he offers or imputes to the believer. Thus, Christianity is about being saved by grace, and this has superseded or replaced God's covenant with the Jewish people and Judaism, which can be summarized in this view as works righteousness. Bottom line, this view pins the law versus grace. Second view we want to look at, the new perspective on Paul. And this is really important because a lot of scholars have moved in this direction in general. For the new perspective on Paul, which includes scholars like E.P. Sanders, N.T. Wright, James D.G. Dunn. Wow, I don't usually say D.G., and it really messes up the flow there, doesn't it? Scott McKnight. Who else would we add? Nijay Gupta is someone who comes to mind. So people who would have this broad view would say that Jewish practices such as circumcision and following dietary laws were never meant as a means to earning salvation. This is an unfortunate misunderstanding about the beliefs of Judaism and the purposes of the Second Temple practices, these things they would do in their worship of God, because some people have thought that all of these practices were about earning something, as we said in the previous view. But ancient Judaism, from the new perspective on Paul, and by the way, we should probably just throw this out there, that it's not really new perspective on Paul as much as new perspective on Judaism, because various scholars then apply this new perspective on Judaism to Paul, right? So Wright's new perspective is slightly different than Dunn, and definitely radically different than Sanders. And so there's nuance within the conversation. But ancient Judaism, from this broad perspective, often called the new perspective on Paul or Judaism, ancient Judaism was always a religion of grace, with the laws functioning as ways of belonging and remaining in the covenantal community. And these were a means of assurance, not a means of earning something. So if you wanted to know that you were still in the community, these were the ways to know that you had right standing with your neighbor and you had right standing with the God of Israel, that you would do these things. And the reason Paul preached against circumcision was because, from this view, in Christ, the national specific boundary markers, like these badges of membership, have been relativized for the sake of unity between Jew and Gentile. So what kinds of things? Let's think about this. I mean, specifically circumcision. You get circumcised as a way of joining and becoming a Jewish person during the Second Temple period, this time from the reconstructed temple after the exile all the way through 70 CE, right? So that's how you become Jewish during that season specifically, is you go through the circumcision rite and become Jewish. You don't actually exist as some other ethnicity plus you're Jewish. You literally are becoming a Jewish person by doing that during those years. And so those kinds of national boundary markers, needing to become Jewish to become a worshiper of the Jewish God, those things have been relativized in Christ. What do we mean by that? Well, Jews who followed Jesus had greater flexibility with the Torah. And this is in continuity with ancient Judaism. So they're not saying, we're no longer Jewish. They're saying, no, we have to flex a little bit here, because if we don't flex, our Gentile friends who are coming to Christ will not be able to sit at the same table with us. And unity is the centerpiece of what Christ has done. God has opened the doors for the Gentiles to come into the worship of Israel's God. And if we don't make those accommodations that create this sort of new family, then we're going to continue to exclude. And so really, in other words, being a member of God's covenantal family through the practice of Torah, through the practices of the law, as we put it, always was experienced as grace for Jewish people, right? So it's not like they were earning anything. They were just trying to know, like, hey, when I mess up, I know I still can step back into favor with God and neighbor by doing this sacrifice or doing these things, because I've been Jewish my whole life. Especially, it's easy to track with males, right? Because on the 8th day of their lives, they're circumcised. And from that moment, actually from the moment they're born into that system, they are, in fact, Jewish, and they are recipients of grace. They didn't earn that covenantal status. They literally just were given it. They were chosen and given grace in spite of any other thing they could have done. And so that, my friends, is what it's all about. It's about staying within the covenantal boundaries. So worship me, not other gods. How do you know you're still in the covenant? Well, you continue to worship me. You're not Curtis. By the way, I don't know why I called myself Curtis. I think I do that at home with my wife because she's like one of 5 people that ever call me Curtis. So anyway, but not me, Kurt, the God of Israel, right? So again, that is what we need to understand, is that it really has to do with the faithful Messiah has come. And so all Jewish specific boundary markers have been relativized. Again, I'll say that again. They've been relativized in order to swing wide the doors for the graceful entry of the Gentiles. Thus, Christianity is in continuity with Judaism. It is Judaism 2.0. It is Judaism was leading to Jesus, and now a new thing has been born out of the old, but they are not radically distinct. They're not grace versus works. This is where the storyline has been heading. I'll give you one last perspective here. Again, this is just about how we posture ourselves with Paul and Judaism. And we've gone from the new perspective, and now we're going to go to the radical new perspective. And the radical new perspective now is mostly called Paul within Judaism. And I should say a couple of things. There's some huge commonalities between the new perspective and the radical new perspective, or Paul within Judaism. And no wonder, right? So it's called the radical new perspective for a reason. It's just taking the argument a little bit further down the line. And so this third approach comes in, and it's really important that we know a few of the names of the scholars that have made this popular in biblical scholarship, although it's not a dominating view, but it is popular. Lloyd Gaston, John Gager, Stanley Stowers, Neil Elliott, Mark Nanos, Pamela Eisenbaum, to name a few, and there's several others. And they're in full agreement. Here's where the two perspectives, new and radical new, where they align really quickly. They understand that the Torah was a gift of God's grace. They also reject the idea that works righteousness is a key issue Paul is addressing regarding Judaism. So what is he actually addressing? Well, this view is addressing something really specific. Paul's driven by an end-time expectation that the nations, those outsiders, would be gathered in so that they could worship Israel's God, distinctly as the nations, the Gentiles. Gentiles and nations, by the way, same word. In fact, Gentile, I've said in a previous episode, is a very unhelpful word, but we'll keep using it because, well, it's ingrained in us. But really, when you hear Gentiles, you should think national situations. You should be thinking about the nations. So what are they trying to do? Well, Paul's like, look, it's the end of time in the sense of God has done finally what we've been waiting for, this new thing. So the nations must come and gather into the covenantal family. But they do this not through conversion like they used to, but through Christ as nations people. Not as Jewish. They're not outsiders who need to become Jewish so that they can worship Jesus. That would be kind of a weird thing. Like, why Jesus then, right? in this system, it wouldn't make any sense. So what does that look like practically? A couple of things. Paul's letters are viewed as written almost exclusively with the Gentiles in mind. And so his negative rhetoric about the Torah is really just driven at Gentiles. So anything you hear about the law that sounds negative is about the Gentiles seeking to apply those laws as though that belongs to them to do, right? This is a huge deal. Because it's a difference between this Paul within Judaism picture that I'm trying to paint for you versus the new perspective, where the new perspective relativizes the Torah and is like, no, the boundary markers have been they're slowly disintegrating almost, especially in contexts where there's Jew and Gentile coming together. The radical perspective, the Paul within Judaism perspective, has a much more positive view of the Torah and its continuity with the Jewish followers of Jesus, like Paul. Here's why. They basically would say that Paul upheld the goodness of the Torah and all of his negative rhetoric about it concerning Jewish practices is directly for Gentile people only. So in this sort of end time scenario, it would make no sense within this perspective if Jewish people are saying, you all need to be Jewish like we are Jewish, and now you have a Jesus. No, they're saying, look, Jesus is the fulfillment that we've all been desiring. The ultimate sort of experience of salvation is found in Jesus exclusively, the representative and embodiment of Israel's God. However, if we require outsiders to become Jewish first, then nothing really has functionally changed if you think about it. And so the nations, as they come in, must look like the nations. I mean, it really makes sense if you think about the Revelation picture, right? Revelation says something like every tongue, tribe, and nation will be present in that last day. And that, my friends, is really critical for the Paul within Judaism approach. There are two distinct ways of practicing messianic life. One that is thoroughly still applies the Torah in a very culturally specific way, and one that's more accommodating for people who are outside of Judaism but find Christ, and they're going to come together. And the role of Jewish folks in this view is that they are to be witnesses to the nations. And that's where the whole conversation about Romans 9 through 11, and really controversial set of texts, comes in. And they have to ask the question, okay, so what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be a Gentile? And are those Jewish people who have not followed Jesus, are they lost forever? And Paul's answer to that seems to be, well, a day will come when, and this is a quote, all Israel will be saved. And what that seems to mean to Paul in within Judaism view would be, yeah, there's a day when the Jewish people are going to ultimately be like, oh, he is our Messiah. Okay. So very fascinating. But again, notice the distinction. Now, lots of distinctions, of course, even within Paul, within Judaism. It's always the one that raises the most interesting questions, and I'm not going to get into all of those. But I would simply say that there are things within Paul, within Judaism, that do have to adapt. But I don't think they're so adapted that they're no longer Jewish. Let me give you an example. Paul is a teacher within Judaism. Jesus, obviously, is a teacher within Judaism. And so Jesus comes on the scene, and his preaching is all to Jewish people. And he adds things that are really important, right? So there used to be a command that simply said, love your neighbor. And Jesus said, well, you got to do that plus love your enemies. Really fascinating, right? Well, that's definitely taking what the Torah said and reworking it around the person of Jesus. But that's still, I would say, from that view, in continuity with Torah obedience or following the law for Jewish people themselves. And so you can get the yoke of Jesus's teaching, to put it one way, like the interpretive lens of Jesus's teaching, and still be a Torah observant, Jesus following Jewish person in fellowship with non-Jewish, Jesus following people who aren't observing all of the nuances of Torah. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So in the end, Jesus is the ultimate pathway for all human beings to be part of this covenantal family. And there is a radical continuity in Judaism that has now incorporated the way of Jesus. So let me conclude with this. What do we do? What do we do with all of these options? Well, I have to say that I'm convinced for sure, and this is for sure, who knows anything for sure these days, right? But I'm convinced that the traditional Paul needs to be radically reshaped around a new perspective on Judaism. I'm also convinced that both the new perspective on Paul, and those, there's many versions of that, and the Paul within Judaism vision of Paul, I'm convinced that both of them have important things to notice and listen to. I love the new perspective on Paul and its emphasis on membership and unity. I think there's really important things there, that unity is at the center of Paul's vision. And in the radical view, or the Paul within Judaism view, I really am appreciative of the fact that it takes Judaism seriously and doesn't divorce it from the movement of Jesus. In fact, many have said that Jesus and the apostles really work within Jewish synagogue-like environments, even as they invite non-Jewish people into the early church. And so there's something more Jewish, I think, than we've kind of been let on to believe in Paul and in the New Testament as a whole. But it is complicated, and I think scholarship in both of those camps really can help us carve a helpful and humanizing good way forward. So, that, my friends, is what I will say for today. Was the Apostle Paul Jewish before and after Jesus? My answer is 100% yes, and not just by ethnicity alone. It is clear to me that Paul practiced Judaism in multiple ways, and that he never rejected it, never even rejected being a Pharisee, which is another episode to be had, I suppose, but rather reworked his Pharisaic Judaism around the person of Jesus and extended that into his mission to preach the good news that now the Gentiles are in throughout his ministry. That, my friends, is very exciting good news. Hope you had a good time listening along. We'll have some more episodes like this. I know people love it when we dig into Paul. So here's my step back into some of those more technical questions, and we will have so many more because they are endless when it comes to 2,000 years ago. A man named Paul had a vision of a resurrected man / embodiment of God called Jesus, and the world changed because of it. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. Grace and peace, my friends.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.